The rain fell not as a baptism, but as a judgment. It hammered the corrugated tin roof of the barn, lashed against the window panes of the small farmhouse, and turned the hard-packed earth of the long driveway into a churning river of mud. For 10 years, Elias Thorne had welcomed such storms. They were an excuse for the world to leave him be, a perfect mirror for the tempest that had never truly settled in his own soul. He sat at his kitchen table, the wood worn smooth by the ghost of his wife's hands, and watched the deluge. It was in the heart of this squall, as lightning bleached the world white for a split second, that he saw them. 3 figures, not ghosts, but something just as ethereal and unsettling, stumbling through the gale. They were hunched against the wind, moving with a desperate, shared rhythm of exhaustion. He stood, his chair scraping against the floorboards, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet house. His first instinct, honed by a decade of solitude, was to douse the lantern, to become one with the shadows and wait for them to pass. They were not his concern. The world and its troubles had been locked out the day he had buried Eleanor, and he had never once felt the urge to turn the key. But they were moving toward his gate, their forms becoming clearer in the gloom. All 3 were women, and as they drew nearer, a detail so improbable it seemed a trick of the rain-streaked light became starkly, undeniably clear: they were all heavily pregnant. One of them, the leader, pushed open the squealing gate and the trio staggered onto his property, their faces pale and pleading in the gloom. The one in the lead looked directly at his window, her eyes finding his as if guided by some primal instinct for sanctuary. Her expression was not one of demand, but of utter, soul-crushing supplication. The storm inside Elias, the one he had nurtured and contained for so long, roared in response. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stay put, to let the world handle its own broken things. He had tried to fix things once, and it had cost him everything. Yet, he could see Eleanor's face in the woman's desperate gaze. He saw the swell of her belly beneath her simple dress, a phantom limb he could still feel ache in his heart. The 3 women huddled together now, a small island of shared misery just beyond his porch, looking as if the next gust of wind might sweep them away entirely. A single, dry sob escaped the smallest of the 3, a sound swallowed by the storm but piercing straight through Elias's carefully constructed walls. He moved without conscious thought, his body betraying the bitter resolve of his mind. He took the old oil lantern from its hook, the glass cool against his calloused fingers, and walked to the door. He didn't open it fully, just a crack, the wind snatching at the wood and trying to tear it from his grip. "What do you want?" His voice was a rasp, rough from disuse, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. The lead woman, her dark hair plastered to her face, took a half-step forward. "Please," she begged, her voice surprisingly strong despite her trembling. "Just until the storm breaks. We have nowhere else to go. We are in trouble." Elias's gaze swept over them, lingering on the impossible truth of their shared condition. 3 sisters, he guessed from their faces, all on the precipice of motherhood, all looking like they were fleeing the very gates of hell. The trouble they were in felt like a tangible thing, a 4th shadow clinging to them in the rain. To let them in was to let that trouble in, to invite the chaos of the world back over his threshold. To turn them away, what would that make him? Could he watch them collapse in the mud from his warm, dry window and still call himself a man? He looked past them, into the churning darkness from which they had emerged, half expecting to see the glint of lanterns or the silhouette of horsemen. There was nothing but the rain and the wind. The decision was a physical weight in his chest. His heart, a dormant, petrified thing, gave a painful lurch. He opened the door wider. "Get inside," he said, the words costing him more than he could have imagined. "Before you catch your death." The warmth of the house was a shock to the sisters, a physical force that seemed to melt the terror frozen on their faces. They stood dripping on the rug by the door, a puddle forming at their feet, their eyes wide as they took in the Spartan but clean interior. It was a home built for one, a place where memories were kept under lock and key, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Elias moved with a quiet, methodical purpose that belied the turmoil raging within him. He stoked the fire in the stone hearth until it crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows that made the small living room feel both larger and more intimate. He gestured towards it with the poker. "Sit. Get warm." He disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 3 thick wool blankets, the scent of cedar and disuse rising from them. He handed one to each sister, his hands careful not to touch theirs, a man handling volatile material. The eldest, the one who had spoken at the door, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and gave him a nod of profound gratitude. "I am Elara," she said softly, her voice gaining some of its strength back in the heat. "These are my sisters, Lyra and Celia." Lyra, the middle sister, huddled closer to the flames, her body still racked with shivers that seemed to come more from fear than cold. Celia, the youngest, managed a weak but genuine smile, her eyes, full of a light that defied their circumstances, fixed on Elias. "Thank you," she whispered. "You are a good man." The words landed like stones in a still pond. He grunted in response, turning away to busy himself with a kettle at the stove, unable to bear the weight of her undeserved praise. He was not a good man. Good men did not hide from the world. Good men did not have ghosts for company. He brought them mugs of hot, sweet tea, and for a long while, the only sounds were the crackling fire, the howling wind outside, and the soft sips of the women drinking. He watched them from the shadows of the kitchen doorway, a sentinel in his own home. He saw how Elara kept a protective arm near her sisters, how Lyra flinched at every loud gust of wind against the windows, and how Celia, despite it all, seemed to radiate a fragile, stubborn hope. It was she who finally broke the silence again. "Our father, he passed a month ago," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "He left us the farm." "It's all we have." Elara shot her a warning look, but Celia pressed on, as if the telling of it was a pressure that had to be released. "A man, Mr. Kane, he says our father owed him a debt. He says the land is his now. He gave us until the end of the week to leave." The name, Kane, was common enough, yet it snagged in Elias's memory like a burr on wool. A flicker of something cold and old. He pushed it aside. "He won't let us take anything," Lyra added, her voice a fearful whisper. "He said we'd leave with nothing but the clothes on our backs." Elias finally spoke, his voice low and even. "And your condition?" He gestured vaguely toward their swollen bellies. A deep blush colored Celia's cheeks, but Elara's expression was hard, defiant. "Our husbands were brothers," she stated simply. "Fishermen. Their boat went down in a storm last winter." All three of them. The sheer, layered tragedy of their story was staggering. Widowed, orphaned, soon to be homeless, and carrying the last legacy of their lost loves. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken grief. Elias felt a familiar ache in his chest, a kinship with these women that he did not want. He had built this fortress of solitude precisely to keep such feelings at bay. And yet, here they were, in his house, their sorrow mingling with his own. He found himself looking at the small, framed photograph on the mantelpiece, the only one he had allowed himself to keep. Eleanor, smiling, her hand resting on her own slightly rounded stomach. It was from the week before the accident. The week before a different kind of monster, a man driving a wagon full of greed and whiskey, had stolen his world. What would you do in this situation? How much of the world's pain can one person be expected to carry? He cleared his throat, the sound rough. "The storm won't break till morning, maybe longer," he said, his decision made without his own consent. "You can take the spare room. It's small, but the bed is sound." He was not offering them a home. He was not offering them protection. He was just offering them a single night's reprieve. At least, that is what he told himself as he laid out clean sheets on the bed that had not been slept in for 10 years, the very air in the room seeming to sigh with a long-forgotten purpose. The morning broke clear and cold, the storm having scrubbed the sky to a pale, fragile blue. The world outside was washed clean, but inside Elias's farmhouse, a new and unsettling tension had taken root. The presence of the sisters, so foreign and vibrant, had fundamentally altered the space. He awoke on his cot in the living room to the smell of coffee, a scent he hadn't bothered with for years. Celia was in his kitchen, moving with a quiet confidence, a small, apologetic smile on her face. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the percolator. "I found the beans in the pantry. We wanted to do something to thank you." Elias merely nodded, taking the mug she offered. The warmth of it in his hands was a strange comfort. But his senses were on high alert, a dormant part of him awakened. He wasn't just a farmer in his home anymore, he was a watchman on his walls. He spent the morning doing his chores, his movements tracked by the anxious eyes of Lyra from the window and the more assessing gaze of Ilara from the porch. He felt their vulnerability like a physical weight on his own shoulders. Late in the afternoon, as he was splitting firewood with a ferocity that was more about venting his inner turmoil than preparing for winter, he saw it, a plume of dust on the horizon, rising from the county road that led to his isolated property. It was too deliberate for a random traveler, too slow for a friendly visit. His blood ran cold. He dropped the axe, his body moving with an instinct he thought he had buried long ago. "Inside," he commanded, his voice sharp and low as he strode towards the porch. "All of you. Get in the cellar." Now fear flashed in their eyes, but they didn't question him. Ilara herded her sisters towards the heavy wooden door set into the kitchen floor. As Celia passed him, her hand brushed his arm. "What is it?" she whispered. "Trouble," he said, his eyes fixed on the approaching dust cloud. He helped Lyra down the steep steps, her breath coming in ragged gasps, before closing the heavy door over them. He slid the wooden dining table over it, a flimsy barricade that was more for his own peace of mind than for any real security. He then walked to the front window, peering through the edge of the curtain. 2 riders. They weren't moving fast, but with the lazy confidence of men who knew they had all the time in the world. They were scouts, probers, sent to sniff out the trail. He knew the type. He'd ridden with men like them, and against them, in a life he'd tried to forget. They reined in their horses 100 yards from his fence, surveying the farmhouse, the barn, the quiet curl of smoke from the chimney. Elias's mind raced. He had 1 rifle, an old Winchester, and about 20 rounds. Not enough for a fight, especially not a fight he wanted. His greatest weapon was the one thing he had cultivated for a decade, the appearance of being a harmless, grieving recluse. He stepped out onto the porch, forcing his shoulders to slump, his expression to be one of mild, weary curiosity. He held up a hand in a non-threatening wave. One of the riders, a burly man with a cruel slit of a mouth, nudged his horse forward. "Howdy, old man," the rider called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Lost something?" Elias asked, his tone gravelly and slow. "Just looking for something," the man replied, his eye scanning every inch of the property. 3 somethings, to be precise. "Young women. Seen them?" Elias shook his head slowly, putting a touch of confusion into his eyes. "Women? Ain't seen nobody but the mail carrier in 6 months. And he only comes when he has to." The rider exchanged a look with his partner. He didn't seem entirely convinced. His gaze lingered on the farmhouse. "You live out here all alone?" "Ever since my wife passed," Elias said, letting a genuine tremor of old grief surface. "It was a weapon, too. Pity could be a shield." The man's partner spoke up, his voice higher, more nasal. "We heard they might have come this way. Running from a debt they owe to Mr. Kane." Elias held his ground, his heart pounding a steady, cold rhythm against his ribs. He forced a short, dry chuckle. "Kane? Silas Kane?" he asked, as if the name were a half-forgotten piece of local gossip. The rider's eyes narrowed. "You know him?" "I know of him," Elias said carefully. "Man who thinks he owns the sun and the moon. If they owe him, I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. But they ain't here. Place is too quiet for that kind of trouble." He gestured around at the silent farm, the very air thick with his curated solitude. For a long moment, the rider just stared, his gaze a physical weight. Elias could feel the sisters in the cellar beneath his feet, their silent, terrified breathing. Finally, the man grunted and reined his horse around. "If you see SM, you send word to Kane's ranch. There's a reward." He didn't wait for an answer, just spurred his horse and rode away, his partner following close behind. Elias stood motionless until their dust was once again just a smudge on the horizon. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. He had turned them away, but it was a temporary victory. They would be back. Kane wasn't a man to give up. He went inside and moved the table, pulling open the heavy cellar door. 3 pale faces looked up at him from the darkness, their eyes filled with a mixture of terror and dawning reverence. He had not just given them shelter, he had stood between them and the wolves. In that moment, the choice was no longer his to make. It had been made for him. He was their protector. And as he looked at their faces, the name Silas Cain echoed in his mind, no longer a vague threat but the key to a locked room in his memory. A room that held the face of another friend, a man named Thomas Finch, the sister's father, and the broken promise Elias had made to him years ago, a promise that had died on the same day as his wife. The revelation struck Elias not like a bolt of lightning, but like the slow, inexorable creep of frost. Thomas Finch. The father of these women had been his friend, one of the few honest men he had known in his former life as a town marshal in a place rotten with corruption. And Silas Cain was the source of that rot. Cain had been the shadow behind the throne, the wealthy rancher who bought politicians and broke laws with impunity. Elias had tried to stand against him, building a case brick by brick, with Thomas Finch as his only secret ally, feeding him information about Cain's land grabs and extortion schemes. But Cain had been too powerful, his web too intricate. Before Elias could act, his world had been shattered. The wagon that ran Eleanor's carriage off the road, the driver was one of Cain's men, drunk and reckless. At the time, Elias had believed it was a tragic, random accident, a cruel twist of fate that had broken him and sent him fleeing into this self-imposed exile. Now, standing in his quiet farmhouse with Thomas Finch's orphan daughters hiding in his cellar, he saw the chilling pattern. It hadn't been an accident. It had been a warning. A message from Cain to stop digging. And it had worked. Racked with grief, Elias had vanished, and Cain had been free to continue his reign. He had not only failed to bring Cain to justice, he had abandoned his friend Thomas to face the monster alone. That guilt was a poison, seeping into the foundations of his grief, making it heavier, more suffocating. He now understood the debt Cain claimed. It wasn't monetary. It was a debt of defiance, a final act of erasure against the family of the man who dared to oppose him. Protecting these sisters was no longer a matter of morality, it was a matter of atonement. It was the only act that could give the last 10 years of hollow existence any meaning. He spent the next 2 days fortifying the farm, his movements precise and grim. He barred the windows, reinforced the doors, and walked the perimeter of his land, noting every line of sight, every piece of cover. He was no longer a farmer, he was the marshal he had once been. He explained the situation to the sisters, the words heavy with a shame he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a decade. He told them of his connection to their father, of his failure. Ilara listened, her expression unreadable, while Lyra wept silently. It was Celia who, once again, offered a shard of light in the oppressive gloom. She placed her hand on his arm, her touch steady. "You didn't fail him," she said, her voice firm. "You're saving his daughters." He would be proud, the words undid him more than any threat could. For the first time in 10 years, Elias felt the sting of tears in his eyes. The wait was the hardest part. The silence of the farm was no longer peaceful but fraught with anticipation. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves, was a potential threat. And then, on the 3rd day, he came. Not with an army, but with a quiet, arrogant procession of 4 riders, Silas Cain himself at the lead. He rode a magnificent black stallion, his posture ramrod straight, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He stopped at the same spot his scouts had, his cold eyes taking in the fortified farmhouse. He didn't shout or make threats. He simply dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men, and walked calmly toward the gate, his hand resting on the ornate grip of the pistol at his hip. "Elias Thorne," Cain called out, his voice smooth and cultured, carrying easily in the still air. "I should have known you'd wash up in a place like this." A hole to match the one in your heart. Elias stepped onto the porch, his old Winchester held loosely in his hands, its barrel pointed at the ground. He looked at the man who had haunted his life from a distance, the architect of his pain. Cain, was all he said, the name a curse on his lips. "I know they're in there, Elias," Cain said with a thin smile. "Thomas Finch's girls. He was always a sentimental fool. Looks like you've picked up his habit. He opened the gate and took a step onto Elias's property, a deliberate act of trespass. This doesn't concern you. It's a private matter between me and their father's estate. You murdered my wife, Silas, Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet carrying the weight of a decade of suppressed rage. Cain's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. That was an unfortunate accident. Your wife was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Just as you were. A lesson you clearly failed to learn. Now, send out the girls, and I'll let you crawl back into your misery. I have no quarrel with a broken man. They're not coming out, Elias said, raising the Winchester until it was level with Cain's chest. And you're not setting foot on this porch. Cain laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You, Elias? You're going to make a stand? The man who ran? The man who let his friend's legacy be wiped out while he wallowed in self-pity? You have no right to play the hero. Every word was a poisoned dart, aimed at the deepest wounds in Elias's soul. He could feel the old shame, the old grief, rising up to choke him. But then he felt something else. He felt the presence of the 3 women behind the door, the 3 innocent lives, the 3 unborn children. He was not the broken man who had arrived here 10 years ago. They had changed him. They had given him a reason to be whole again. I'm not the man I was, Cain, Elias said, his voice ringing with a newfound clarity. And this is where your road ends. You took my future. You will not take theirs. Cain's face hardened, the mask of civility falling away to reveal the predator beneath. A noble sentiment, he sneered, and his hand moved like a striking snake, dropping towards his pistol. The world narrowed to the space between the 2 men. It wasn't a duel of honor, it was the final, violent collision of 2 opposing forces. But Elias was ready. He hadn't spent the last 2 days just boarding up windows. He had been reawakening a part of himself he thought was dead. As Cain's hand dropped, Elias didn't fire the Winchester. Instead, he swung it, the heavy wooden stock catching Cain's wrist with a sickening crack. The pistol clattered to the ground as Cain cried out, a sound of pure shock and pain. The 3 men behind him spurred their horses forward, drawing their own weapons, but they were too late and too far. Elias was already moving, flowing down the porch steps with a speed that defied his age. He kicked Cain's pistol away and slammed the butt of his rifle into the man's gut, doubling him over. He was not fighting with rage, but with a cold, clear purpose. This was not vengeance for Eleanor. Vengeance was a hot, blinding emotion. This was justice for Ilara, Lyra, and Celia. This was the fulfillment of a promise to their father. This was redemption. As Cain's men charged, Elias used his knowledge of the terrain, the land that had been his prison and was now his fortress. He kicked over a rain barrel, the sudden gush of water spooking the lead horse and sending its rider tumbling. He dove behind the woodpile he had been working on just days before, the familiar scent of pine and earth filling his senses. A bullet splintered the log above his head. He didn't fire back wildly. He waited. He listened. He let their overconfidence be their undoing. One of the men, seeing Elias concealed, dismounted and charged forward on foot, thinking to overwhelm him. It was exactly what Elias had anticipated. He rose from behind the woodpile, not with his rifle, but with the splitting axe he had left there. He threw it, not to kill, but to disarm. The axe spun end over end, its heavy head smashing into the man's shoulder, dropping him to his knees with a howl of pain. The 3rd rider, seeing his companions dispatched with such brutal efficiency, hesitated. That hesitation was all Elias needed. He leveled the Winchester and fired once. Not at the man, but at the ground just in front of his horse's hooves. The animal screamed and reared, unseating the rider, who landed hard and lay stunned. It was over in less than a minute. Silence descended once more, broken only by the groans of the injured men. Elias walked over to Cain, who was clutching his broken wrist, his face pale with a mixture of agony and disbelief. The power, the arrogance, had been stripped away, leaving only a pathetic, whimpering bully. "It's over, Silas," Elias said, his voice calm. He retrieved Cain's pistol and tucked it into his belt before collecting the other weapons. He herded the 3 conscious men, including a limping and defeated Cain, into his barn and locked the heavy door. He knew they wouldn't stay put for long, but he didn't need long. He returned to the house, his heart no longer pounding with adrenaline, but with a deep, steady calm he hadn't felt in years. He opened the door. The 3 sisters stood there, huddled together, their faces a canvas of awe and overwhelming relief. Ilara's stoic facade had crumbled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Lyra was clinging to her, trembling but no longer with fear. Celia, ever the beacon of hope, was smiling through her own tears. Elias looked at them, at the life they represented, at the future he had just secured. The ghosts of his past were still there, but they were no longer howling. They were quiet, as if at peace. The long storm inside him had finally broken. The sun was rising, and for the first time in a decade, he felt its warmth. The quiet days that followed were the true beginning. Elias used Cain's own horse to ride to the nearest town with a federal marshal, a town far from Cain's sphere of influence. He told them everything, and with Cain and his men captured, the dam of fear broke. Others came forward, and the full extent of Silas Cain's empire of corruption was brought into the light of day. But back at the farm, a different kind of world was being built. The fortress of solitude slowly, surely, transformed into a home. The first birth came with the autumn leaves. Ilara, strong and fierce, brought a son into the world, a boy with her own determined eyes. Elias, clumsy but resolute, boiled water and held her hand, the terror of new life chasing away the last of his own personal ghosts. Lyra followed in the deep winter, her daughter born during a gentle snowfall, a quiet, peaceful child who rarely cried. And Celia's son arrived with the first crocuses of spring, a cheerful, gurgling baby who seemed to carry his mother's innate optimism. The house, once a silent monument to loss, now echoed with the sounds of life. The rhythmic creak of a rocking chair, the soft lullabies sung by the sisters, the tiny, explosive sneezes of newborns. Elias became the silent, watchful patriarch of this unexpected family. He taught the sisters how to run the farm, his old knowledge returning with a newfound sense of purpose. He repaired the fences not to keep the world out, but to keep their little world safe. He tilled the soil not out of duty, but with the hope of a harvest that would feed them all. Years passed. The babies grew into toddlers, their small hands gripping Elias's calloused fingers as he showed them the wonders of the farm, a ladybug on a leaf, a new calf in the barn, the way the sun set the western hills on fire. They called him Grand Elias, a name that filled the hollow spaces in his heart. The farm thrived. The sisters, bound by blood and shared experience, became formidable women, their laughter a constant melody against the backdrop of the wind in the pines. They were no longer victims fleeing a monster, they were pioneers, matriarchs of a new beginning, built on the foundations of an old man's redemption. Elias Thorne, the widower who had locked himself away to nurse his grief, had discovered that the only true cure for a broken heart is to find a new one to protect. His solitude had been a long, dark night, but these 3 women, and the lives they carried, had been the dawn. They had not just arrived at his farm, they had led him home. What does it take to truly heal from a devastating loss? Can a single act of courage redeem a lifetime of regret? We believe that hope can be found in the most unexpected places, and that a closed heart can always be opened again by the quiet knock of someone in need. If this story touched you, tell us in the comments about a time when an act of kindness changed your life or the life of someone you know. Your stories inspire us all. And for more inspirational tales of redemption and the power of human connection, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you never miss a new story.